So a second time they called for the man who had been blind and said, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "Whether he is a sinner I do not know. There is one thing I do know. I was blind, but now I see." "What did he do to you?" they asked. "How did he open your eyes?" He replied, "I already told you and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciple?" Then they heaped insults on him and said, "You are his disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but we do not know where this man is from." "That is remarkable indeed," the man said. "You do not know where he is from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to the one who worships him and does his will. Never before has anyone heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could not do anything like this." They replied, "You were born in utter sin, and you are instructing us?" And they threw him out. When Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, he found the man and said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" he replied. "Tell me, so that I may believe in him." "You have already seen him," Jesus answered. "He is the one speaking with you." "Lord, I believe," he said, and he worshipped Jesus. Then Jesus declared, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind may see, and those who see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees who were with him heard this, and they asked him, "Are we blind too?" "If you were blind," Jesus replied, "you would not be guilty of sin. But since you claim you can see, your guilt remains." These passages, John 9:24-41, the story of the man who was blind and can now see, can be taken a couple of ways. The traditional interpretation is spiritual blindness. We are not meant to infer that the man in question has physically gained the power of sight, so much as we should take from this story his newfound spiritual awakening and belief in Christ as representative of his newfound ability to see. I'm no theologian, and certainly no Christian, but there is a certain pull to this passage if you look at it as the story of a misguided man who has found their correct path. There is another side to the passage though, the literal, the side that, in some interpretations, has made people a not insignificant amount of money.
The mark of Satan is upon them.
You say, is that gonna happen to me yet?
If your body's feeling bad, and it's the only one you have, you wanna take away the pain, go out walking in the rain, watch the flowers go to bed, ask the man inside your head, your spirit never have to grieve, all you got to do is believe. The faith healer. Can I put my hands on you? Can I put my hands on you? The faith healer. The faith healer.
The faith healer comes bearing promises that are almost impossible. Not only will the blind be able to see, but cancers will be cured, monetary problems solved, crutches unnecessary. In spite of obvious and justifiable scepticism and more than a few exposés of the most visible ones, they still persist.
Popoff?
Yes.
Matt Mahar with Inside Edition. Could I ask you a few questions about your ministry? Hey, you're squeezing me.
Sorry.
How can you justify taking all of this money from people that are desperate? Can you just answer us one question?
Can you just move away, please?
Would you talk to us later, please?
No.
Flim Flam is his profession. That's what he does best. He's very good at it, and naturally he's going to go back to it.
Hallelujah!
Says she only stopped sending Popoff money 2 months ago when she had no money left for food. She says she now feels that she was brainwashed by watching Popoff on television.
On almost any Christian channel you can find, somewhere, a Faith Healers infomercial where you too can potentially solve your problems with the guidance of a minister and his prayer handkerchief or miracle spring water. So long as you plant a sufficient monetary seed.
If you're ready to live life at a higher level, then, like Jacob, you're ready to make a vow of tithe. First, you set the level of abundance you want to receive.
You're not paying on what God has already given you. You're stretching your faith.
Then, as you pay on your vow, you'll experience God's blessings above all that you can ask or imagine.
God paid all her bills and took her husband healed out of the hospital.
Call the number on your screen now. Make your vow of tithe today.
You will see footage wherein a charismatic man touches whoever has been brought to him, seemingly electrifying them with the power of Christ, throwing their crutches asunder. Suddenly, on a rush of adrenaline, they can walk freely. The cancer afflicting them has gone. As for the agony of walking crutchless down the stairs in the hours after, or the somewhat graver doctor's appointments in the following days, well, the cameras weren't there to film those. Faith healing is a subject that greatly interests me. As a blight on the modern world, sure. There's no shortage of people making millions from supposedly healing the sick and vulnerable to be angry at, or people trying to justify their need for the Lord's own private jet to spread healing and the good word. But today's video, something different obviously, aims to go back further than that, away from the clear glass buildings, world tours and vast fortunes that define faith healing today. My subject is an Irish faith healer from the 17th century, an odd interest in life, and a career that was subject to almost no exposés. He went about his business undeterred and almost unquestioned. I speak of the Stroker, Valentine Greatrakes. Through his story you will see just how long we've dealt with faith healing, but there are certain differences here, marks of the historical period that also require going into, if we are to understand why Greatrakes, the Hinn or Peter Popoff of his day, was so successful, why he amassed a great deal of riches in his time, and was never caught. There is after all an imperial side to the story. Divine healing stretches far beyond Greatrakes, indeed hundreds of years before he came to prominence. But the form it took was different to what we know now, very similar yet different, same. And only a small group of people were thought of, not just by the populace but by even the smartest minds of the day, to possess the ability. Kings and queens. More specifically the kings and queens of Europe, but largely England and France. It was long believed for hundreds of years that kings and queens were answerable only to God. They were not answerable to the will of the people or anyone else, and any attempt to depose an unjust king was not only criminal, but sacrilegious. King James I of England developed this as a theory, the divine right of kings, although the practice itself predates him by hundreds of years. Similar theories were also taught in other parts of the world, although Asian concepts such as the mandate of heaven, for example, differ in certain ways from the divine right. Now, as God's representatives on earth, certain other powers were accredited to kings, one of which was the healing of the sick, which was seen as an important part of their duties. This process of healing would become known as the royal touch. In England, the process arguably dates back all the way to Edward the Confessor, although the first kin that we have very strong evidence of practicing the royal touch for is Henry III, who passed it on to his son Edward I, aka Longshanks, who certainly started practicing the touch on his return from the Crusades in 1274. Now, what did the royal touch entail? It is a process that should be familiar and was utterly entrenched by the time of Henry VII, the first Tudor kin. After defeating Richard III and attaining the throne at the climax of the Wars of the Roses, he was obsessed with proving the legitimacy of his reign, and thus would touch 7 or 8 people every year. The monarch touches, or strokes the face or neck of an infected person, and then they hang a medal around the person's neck. This would be a gold emblem known as a touch piece. Bible passages would be read, in particular Mark 16 to 18, "They shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover." The inference of this passage was to confirm the monarch's immunity from disease. Finally, prayers would be offered. The modern equivalent to what is often seen in faith healing now, from the touch and the prayers to the touch piece itself, are pretty clear. Skepticism about the touch was present, but not necessarily in abundance. Sometimes it manifested in more enterprising ways. It is known that some would seek the touch of the monarch not for the purposes of healing, but in order to obtain the touch piece and sell it on the market. However, the touch itself was not usually questioned, in part because it usually appeared to work. People would be touched by the monarch, and they would not die. They would be healed of their illnesses. How come? Are monarchs truly descended from God? Well, no, not really. The success of the royal touch has more to do with the illness that it was mostly used to treat. The kin's evil seems to signify a truly horrendous disease. One might think of King Herod the Great, who spent his final weeks in a grotesque pain that took over his entire body, often known simply as Herod's evil. The kin's evil would create gruesome, large and visible infections about the head and neck of its prey, making their sickness obvious to all. The afflicted would be set about by chills and fevers too, rendering the case even clearer. Strangely visited people, all swollen and ulcerous, pitiful to the eye, as Shakespeare put it. Is there any hope for such loathsome wretches? Yes, in the kin's right hand, for if they are touched, they shall once again be made whole. So what was this disease really? We have a proper name for it now: tuberculous cervical lymphadenitis, or, shortly, scrofula, caused by bacterial infections, not necessarily tuberculous ones, in the lymph nodes, hence the abscesses around the head and neck. The visible nature of the disease, in truth, makes it look more fearsome than it actually is. Scrofula itself is not, nor has ever really been, a fatal disease in and of itself, and even in medieval times a case of scrofula would usually resolve itself in remission, although its presence did often signify a slightly more fatal case of tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is itself now less common than it once was, and obviously there are better treatments than being touched by a monarch's hand, although it and scrofula are still existent both in less developed parts of the world and amongst severely immunocompromised patients, such as those in the latter stages of HIV/AIDS. In the early years of the royal touch, monarchs would touch for all kinds of ailments, including such things as blindness, believe it or not. However, the purpose of the touch was always primarily the treatment of scrofula, and by the reign of Elizabeth I, monarchs would touch for scrofula only. The largely non-fatal nature of the disease meant that the cure had more chance to be seen as working, even if we can see now that the disease was likelier to have cleared itself up either on its own, or with even so much as a rudimentary cleansing. Nicholas Culpeper, the herbalist, claimed to have been able to cure his daughter of scrofula within a week using lesser celandine. Now, personally, I wouldn't recommend this if you happen to get scrofula, as the plant is a common garden weed that could result in nausea, vomiting, or even hepatitis and jaundice if ingested. As rudimentary as medical knowledge may have been at the time, I certainly wonder how much people, particularly in the royal courts of the day, would have picked up on this. The simpler ways of looking at the royal touch process, either that the monarch itself actually believed that they had the power to heal, or that the people believed that the monarch themselves were in possession of such powers, I don't think really tell the whole story. It is better to think of royal touch as something of a political tool, one whose practice varied depending on the king and queen in question. Some touched more than others for various reasons. Henry VII, as mentioned, wished to prove his legitimacy, and this was also the case with Elizabeth I as the Virgin Queen, although she downplayed her healing ability somewhat after being excommunicated by the Catholic Church after, beheading Mary Queen of Scots. James I, previously James of Scotland, touched less than most, not for any religious reason as such, but mainly because he was quite squeamish, and often preferred to simply wave his hands over the afflicted area rather than touch them. He was kind of useless. In France, the touch was more common, to the point where people would flock to the preserved arm of Saint Louis IX, located in Poblet Monastery in Catalonia, for hundreds of years to be touched by it, this old dead man's arm. It could even be used as a propaganda against a kin. Henry III of France fell foul of the Catholic League, who issued edicts claiming that his royal touch was useless due to his immorality. It was often said by them that he laid with both man and woman. Such edicts had strong effects. Henry III would be stabbed in the abdomen by a Dominican friar in 1589 and died the day after from his wounds. With such things in mind, one can grasp the true purpose of the royal touch. It was not so much a healing tool as a political one, an easy way for a monarch to have contact with their people, their peasantry, something that the people would duly reciprocate, a way to remain popular, to appease the church and those who believed in the divine right of kings, and to stop a knife from entering your belly. An important part of a monarch's duties, and one English monarch above all used it more than any other. King Charles II is the only English monarch to touch as much as the French ones. It is believed that he touched over 92,000 people during the course of his reign. He came into power on the restoration of the monarchy after spending 9 years in exile in France. His father, Charles I, had ended up losing his head after the English Civil Wars. The monarchs came back in following a political crisis after the death of Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell, and with it came back the old traditions, including the touch. Presumably Charles must have seen the greater prevalence of the touch in France during his years of exile, and as such made it a large part of his reign, along with oft-quoted witticisms and plenty of extramarital affairs as the stories go. And so, under the reign of Charles II, demand for the touch grew greater than ever. While it had been practised for hundreds of years, Charles II almost made it fashionable, I suppose would be a good word for it. But he is only one man, and surely one man can't touch everybody. And this is the point where a man from Afani in Ireland, previously an old soldier from Cromwell's army of Puritan Roundheads, enters the picture and becomes one of the most famous people of the age. Valentine Greatrakes was 37 years of age by the time he arrived in England in 1666. He had started practicing healing in earnest a few years previously in his home country. He claimed to have cured several people of scrofula and claimed that he could cure a great deal of ailments, including wounds and ulcers. He claimed that he had, to his satisfaction, cured all who came in contact with him, and people would flock to him from all parts of Ireland. However, the bishop's court at Lismore saw that he had no licence and forbade him from practising his faith healing in Ireland in 1665. Not that it mattered much. He would soon be invited to England by Lord Broghill, his old commander in Cromwell's army, where he would continue his practice, travelling the country. In doing this, he soon caught the attention of King Charles, who summoned him to Whitehall, and while he did not necessarily believe that Greatrakes had a miraculous power, he was certainly not convinced by his demonstrations, he did not forbid him to continue the practice. And thus 1666 would be the year, at least for a time, of Valentine Greatrakes. He would become an incredibly popular person, holding court at a place in London where people from all walks of life would assemble to be cured of all that afflicted them. He came to London at a good time. The city was still reeling from the Great Plague that had taken hold the previous year, the final outbreak of the Black Death in England that killed over 100,000 of the city's inhabitants. There was no shortage of maladies for Greatrakes to treat. He swept through the capital city much like a fire in Pudding Lane would in September of the same year. He would earn the nickname the Stroker through the way that he conducted his healing. He would lay his hands on the afflicted area and then stroke in the direction of the nearest extremity, apparently moving the disease to another area of the body. When the disease reached the extremity, it would apparently be gone, and the afflicted would be healed. As for the mania that surrounded his glorious person, I'll leave it to this contemporary account, reproduced in James Randi's book The Faith Healers. A rumour of the prophet's coming soon spread all over the town, and the hotel was crowded by sick persons, who came full of confidence in their speedy cure. Greatrakes made them wait a considerable time for him, but came at last, in the middle of their impatience, with a grave and simple countenance that shewed no signs of his being a cheat. The host prepared to question him strictly, hoping to discourse with him on matters that he had heard of. But he was not able to do so, much to his regret, for the crowd became so great, and cripples and others pressed around so impatiently to be first cured, that the servants were obliged to use threats and even force before they could establish order among them. The prophet affirmed that all diseases were caused by evil spirits. Every infirmity was with him a case of diabolical possession. He boasted of being much better acquainted with the intrigues of demons than he was with the affairs of men. Catholics and Protestants visited him from every part, all believing that power from heaven was in his hands. So great was the confidence in him that the blind fancied they saw the light which they could not see, the deaf imagined that they heard, the lame that they walked straight, and the paralytic that they had recovered the use of their limbs. Randi, in his book, goes on to equate this process, the lengthy wait, the inability to question, the attribution of the spirits and the imagination of the cure, to modern faith healing. Skeptical people who have attended modern faith healing shows have spoken of an ever-growing restlessness and anticipation in crowds that builds almost to a fever pitch, even before the healer makes their appearance, fueled by religious music that is continuous, inescapable, droning, almost hypnotic in its tone. In such an arena, it is impossible for anyone to be able to question the effects of the healer's treatment then and there. People would often fall to the ground, prostrating themselves in violent agitation at the mere sight and sound of Greatrakes, almost proving his power to the crowd before he even got into the business of stroking them. How often do you see such things happen at the modern faith healing show? You may well wonder, in classic fashion, surely no one could be expected to swallow this tripe. And yet of course they did. Considering the impact of the aforementioned plague of 1665 and the disillusionment with orthodox medicine that followed it, the success of Greatrakes shouldn't even be a surprise. And Greatrakes didn't just find true believers among the crowds of the wretched that surrounded him, he even found some amongst some of the great intellectuals of the day. Robert Boyle, a man regarded as the first modern chemist, was one of those who was somewhat taken in by Greatrakes, who wrote a book specifically to him with the catchy title, A Brief Account of Mr. Valentine Greatrakes, and Divers of the Strange Cures by him lately performed, written by himself in a letter addressed to the Honourable Robert Boyle, Esquire, whereunto are annexed the testimonials of several eminent and worthy persons of the chief matters on facts therein related. I think Fiona Apple may have been influenced by it. In any case, the book, which has been reproduced, contains various testimonies from Boyle and other eminent medical practitioners of the day attesting to the effect of Greatrakes' stroking technique, such as the following. Lewis Bonavent, aged 27 years, upon a cold token after childbirth, about a month before Michaelmas last, fell into a lameness in her shoulders, arms, knees and hands, with a violent pain in her stomach, head and ears. Upon the first stroking by Mr. Greatrakes, which was about 3 weeks since, she could lift her hands to her head, which she could not do before. Upon the second stroking, she recovered her knees, of which she had no use as to going before, but went upon all four, and upon the third stroking, which was in our presence, she could go without rocking or waving, and feels herself well at this present. This is but one case that Boyle observed, but there were plenty more. Most of them involved this programme of stroking, often over the course of multiple visits, in order to dislodge the pain. And then there is the case of a 45-year-old woman, unnamed, suffering from deafness and dropsy, who reportedly snatched up some of Valentine Greatrakes' urine and proceeded to drink some of it, while also putting some of it into her ears. Apparently, over the next day, her symptoms decreased dramatically as she passed great amounts of wind, vomited up thick, bladder-esque skin, and passed gallons of water. Apparently, the treatment worked and the woman was cured, mind. So if you're still unable to shake off an illness after multiple visits to the GP, you could always ask them for a quick taste of their aquavita. Couldn't hurt, could it? Boyle, a member of the Royal Society and again a founding father of modern chemistry, was, if not completely convinced, supportive, as were most of Charles II's royal court. Still, it is important to look at Boyle's understanding and support of Greatrakes in the context of the times. Modern chemistry had yet to take hold, and medical treatment was still very much totally in the hands of the physicians. You know, bloodletting, cutting out sores, amputation and so forth. In these times, Robert Boyle, the chemist, could also be seen as a radical in 1666, much like Valentine Greatrakes, the faith healer. While their practice obviously differed, both existed on the outside of things. As for Charles II, while he himself had not forbidden Greatrakes to continue his work, he was still somewhat wary of it, and perhaps with good cause. If this man can come over from Ireland with the powers of healing in his hands, what makes the king's hands any more special than another's? Such a point was made by one of Greatrakes' biggest advocates, a man named Henry Stubb, who dubbed Greatrakes the miraculous conformist, compared the miracles of Greatrakes with those of Christ and the Apostles, and suggested that Greatrakes' ability suggested a levelling of the king's sacred powers, that no more was the king the only person who could use his hands to cure the king's evil. Strong words, considering that the English Civil War was still fresh in people's minds, the time when, amongst other things obviously, the divine right of kings clashed with the belief that all men are created equal. And of course the divine right lost that one. Charles II didn't exactly want to end up like his father, and so Charles let Greatrakes go, not wanting to cause yet another political crisis by denying the popular man's practice. However, not everybody was an advocate, and there do exist examples of people being sceptical of Greatrakes' work, in particular another catchily titled pamphlet by one David Lloyd, Wonders No Miracles, or Mr. Valentine Greatrakes' Gift of Healing examined upon occasion of a sad effect of his stroking, March the 7th, 1665, at one Mr. Cressett's house in Charterhouse Yard, in a letter to a reverend divine living near that place. This work is an interesting read for various reasons. Firstly, there is a brief summation of faith healers, or enthusiasts as the pamphlet calls them, who existed before Greatrakes, such as a man who believed that he could raise the dead, and decided to test the theory by taking his own life, or a Grecian who travelled 2,400 miles to cure an emperor of his deafness, only to find that they had been dead for the past 4 years, an Italian who came to France claiming he could make the blind see, who ended up losing both of his eyes, a man who, after his children died of the sickness, presumably the plague, kept them unburied until they stunk in the hope of a resurrection, or a German who thought that he could cure the Duke of Tuscany's ills by breathing on him, and ended up dying a prisoner in Leghorn. Lloyd's account of what he saw in the work of Greatrakes certainly is at odds with what those distinguished members of the Royal Society saw in him, and is perhaps best summed up with the following excerpt, which more than any other contemporary account seems to concentrate on the true aftermath of Greatrakes' stroking treatment. But this man pretends to nothing that grieves or disobligeth men, crosseth no man's opinion, stands in no man's way, only takes on him to help the miserable and afflicted, and to do good. And yet is cried upon not certainly because he doth such innocent things as cure a toothache, help the eyesight, lance a sore, which good old women have practised these many years, without any clamour against them, but because he pretendeth these things and doth them not, and so puts an injury upon people, which they are most impatient of, called by them a cheat. And to make it evident that this whole affair is but a cheat, I'll not instance in the 1,000 that have been deluded by him in Ireland, the West, in Warwickshire, and other places, nor those at Whitehall, St. James, Lambeth, Westminster, Fleet Street, Bread Street, Cheapside, Foster Lane, that make horrid complaints of his undecent and intolerable handling of all their parts, of his pinching, rubbing, chafing, and lancing their sores, of his inflaming of their blood and humours, and rendering many of them by cutting them and other ways incurable. Not to tell you that there is not a man, woman, or child that may be trusted and are well known that is the better of him, that all that he doth is but by raising people's imaginations, especially the weaker sort, by rubbing and chafing, to scatter the humour for the present to the patient's little ease, till it returneth with more violence after the chafing than ever. I say not to instance in anything but what I have seen. From what Lloyd saw, it appeared that those who were treated by Greatrakes through his stroking, lancing and otherwise inappropriate fondling, if anything, ended up the worse for it. That illnesses they may well have recovered from naturally were exacerbated by his treatment, and their personages most thoroughly insulted. Such is the way of faith healing. In the ecstatic seconds after the touch has been applied, someone might feel lighter than air, that they can do anything, to throw down their crutches and see the light which they previously could not. This delirium is the foundation stone of all faith healing. For in the cold light of day, once the adrenaline levels break and roll back, the condition remains the same, and the victim is deceived. Greatrakes did make a typical refutation of Lloyd's claims, amongst others, in his address to Robert Boyle, which was published at the end of his English trip. It is a rebuttal that, again, may well be familiar to those who have followed contemporary healers, that these naysayers are, of course, people who lack faith. This is the introduction to his letter, a curious piece of text for what is between the lines, a pine to his standing as a simple, God-fearing man, who yet just so happens to have been given this miraculous gift of the healing of all. It is interesting to see how these two contradictory sides are balanced in Greatrakes' mind. Though I had not the happiness formerly to have an acquaintance with you, yet I was no stranger to your worth and virtue, which have made you as much admired and reverenced abroad as honoured and beloved at home. And therefore I have assumed the confidence to make this address to your honour, whose repute and testimony to the world will be so powerful, knowing your wisdom, devotion, and learning to be so great, that truth may find belief, God have glory, and his poor instrument be justified before men, who have no farther design in the distribution of that talent which the all-healing God has entrusted him withal, than the honour of his Maker, and the good of his poor fellow creatures, whose distempers, many of them, neither art nor physic probably could reach, which caused him cheerfully, that he might not be found an unfaithful steward, to cast all his worldly pleasures and delights behind his back, to run himself into the midst of all diseases, to make his house a hospital, and forsake his own interest and advantages, to labour day and night, and oftentimes run the hazard of his liberty and life by the crowds, pressings, steams and stinks of the multitudes and ulcerous persons, which you can well witness few men can brook or undergo. And what is worse than all this, the scandalous and false reports of lying tongues, which have caused him who never had the ambition to publish himself to the world farther than by his deeds, to act this vindication in answer to a pamphlet called by the title of Wonders No Miracles, wherein the author, a certain obscure person, one that never saw me nor knew anything of me, very confidently takes upon him to be my herald and confessor, and to represent me in such black characters, as if I were so horrid a monster that my very name should affright the reader. Sir, I never injured this gentleman in word or deed in all my life, and yet he who pretends himself to be a minister of the gospel is so extremely beyond the walls of charity, invective against me. But, you know, sir, if to be accused only be sufficient, who can be found innocent? I have enough of provocations given me to reflect, but God be praised I have learned a better lesson, and shall return him good for evil, if it lies in my power. I beseech God I may never suffer as a murderer, or as a thief, or as an evildoer, or as a busy man in other men's matters. But if I suffer for doing good to persons in misery freely, I hope I have no cause to be ashamed, but to glorify God on this behalf, who gave both the gift and mind to use it. Greatrakes would, in the end, go on to win this public battle of reputation. His letter goes on to provide testimony from the man who David Lloyd thought to be his star witness, John Cresset, the afflicted person whom he saw the stroking of and believed to have not been cured of anything. But Cresset claimed that he was indeed cured fully by the stroking of Greatrakes, and that Lloyd's pamphlet was little more than an untruthful attack on the man's personal character. Again, this is perhaps not surprising. It has often been noted that even as someone struggles down the stairs, clearly in agonising pain after having their crutches quite literally broken at a faith healing show, that they still believe earnestly that the faith healer has cured them of their ills. Such is the nature of an incredibly strong and intractable faith. Lloyd's other great mistake was letting his own ardent royalism get in the way. His pamphlet is indeed quite filled with personal attacks against the man, and plenty more against his Irish ancestry that would, well, they wouldn't exactly fly today. Truthfully, he never stood much of a chance against the popularity of the faith healer. With this final flourish, Greatrakes would go back to Ireland in May of 1666, and never set foot in England again. He would live on £1,000 a year, and would not resume his faith healing in his home country. He lived quietly for the remainder of his years, and died on the 28th of November 1682, a quite well-off landowner. In spite of the scepticism shown him by the likes of David Lloyd, Greatrakes' reputation never took all that much of a hit in his lifetime. When he died, his reputation was unblemished, and the name of the Stroker still carried legendary weight. The year of Greatrakes was perhaps the high point of faith healing in this country, and there would not come another for at least 200 more years. The royal touch, as much as it was used a great deal by Charles II, would not survive him by that long. The glorious revolution of 1688 put William III, previously William of Orange, onto the throne, and marked a definitive end to the belief in the divine right of kings, and with it the royal touch. A note should be made about Greatrakes' political impact, which is one of the lenses people often look at him through today. He was an important figure in England during the very early Restoration period, but also in Ireland in the years following the Interregnum, the period when Cromwell invaded and directly killed or starved an untold amount of Irish Catholics. After Cromwell, the Catholics would naturally bite back hard in Ireland, and Greatrakes stood as a high-profile figure for Protestants, although he had no issue with treating either Protestants or Catholics. While people were divided on the effectiveness of the stroking, he was loved amongst the populace. His popularity made him hard to touch. While both Charles II and in particular bishops of Ireland took great issue with his work, they dared not cause damage to his person for fear of a reprisal in very shaky political times. And thus Greatrakes was allowed to continue his faith healing practices until ultimately he decided to call it a day and live off his land and fortune. One of the great summations of the work of Valentine Greatrakes is given in Charles Mackay's 1841 book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, another early classic of scepticism, in which he writes, Mr. Valentine Greatrakes practised upon himself and others a deception, that God had given him the power of curing the king's evil. In the course of time he extended his powers to the curing of epilepsy, ulcers, aches and lameness. Crowds which formed around him were so great that the neighbouring towns were not able to accommodate them. The two key words in that summation being upon himself. It is not always the case that faith healers are entirely cynical people. Some of them actually do believe, with a straight face, that they do heal people. Or more accurately, they have committed this act of deception upon people for so long that they ultimately deceive themselves, almost as a means of justification. Greatrakes remains one of the great examples. He is far from the only one though. He may be far from the first faith healer, but Greatrakes is perhaps the first modern faith healer. There's plenty of good reason for filling this video with clips of modern faith healing. It's not just because, well, there isn't exactly a plethora of video footage of Greatrakes in action. In the end, the modern faith healing show of today is little different in execution from what Greatrakes did. He codified the formula, set a template, a show that gave no breathing room to the naysayers, allowed the infirm to be fully deceived, and let the healer take the credit and the spoils in full. His name may not be well known, but his legacy is as undeniable as it is ugly.
All things are possible if you only believe, because God has something better for you.